medicine, the body, and society. So I'm going to pass the microphone so each person can introduce themselves. I'm the co-author of Lissa, which is one of the books that we'll be talking about. And this is Eric. Eric Plemons will introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Eric Plemons. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology here at the University of Arizona, and I'll be discussing my book, The Look of a Woman, Facial Feminization Surgery and the Aims of by which I mean transgender medicine.
Hi, I'm Coleman Nye. I'm the co-author with Shireen Hamdi of Lissa. I always get the subtitle wrong, actually, a story of friendship, medical promise, and revolution. I'm an assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Simon Fraser University, and I'm really excited to talk about Lissa and about your book as well. Yeah. So I guess, okay.
I have one very fast thing to say. Sorry, I'm jumping in here. All of these authors are wonderful, and they have some books for sale. If you're interested in buying a copy and having them signed, you can buy books at the bookstore sales and signing tent, which is right around the corner on the other side of these exhibitor booths. And they'll be here to sign for about a half an hour after the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. Okay, thank you. So I'll talk a little bit about Lissa, which Coleman and I did collaboratively as a project. It's actually the first book in a series that wants to combine comics, the use of graphic novels and comics, with anthropology research. So a very enterprising editor at the University of Toronto Press named Anne Brackenberry had this idea. She wasn't sure an academic press would take it seriously. It really was an uphill battle, but we were the first authors to sign on. And we don't have artistic backgrounds ourselves, so we were at Brown University at the time, which is, for people who know, right next to the Rhode Island School of Design, which is a great art school. And we were able to go to the illustration department and recruit two amazing undergrads who were seniors at the time, who did all the artwork, did all the paneling, telling our story. So I'll tell a little bit about what the story is about before turning it to Eric, and then Coleman will talk about the overlaps between our two projects. So Lissa, which is the title, is an Egyptian Arabic word. It's a colloquial word that means not yet, or there's still time, or it's not over yet. And the issue of time was something that we played with throughout the book. One of the characters, it tells the story of two different characters, and each character is based on our research. So the Egyptian character is based on the field work I did in Egypt about organ transplantation and other bioethical issues. And the American character, who happens to live in Cairo, is based on Coleman's amazing research, which is on women who test positive for the BRCA gene that predisposes them to breast and ovarian cancer, and what decisions they make about that, with that genetic test knowledge. So Coleman was started out as my PhD student at Brown, and she had all of this really fascinating research, and we talked a lot about how our two projects came together. So for example, when I was in Egypt, I would see these young women who were in dialysis, for example. This one story really stuck in my head. It was a young woman who had kidney failure, and the physician was really frustrated with her. He kept saying, if you don't get a kidney, if you don't get a new kidney, you're going to die. You're too young to throw away your life like this. You're too young to spend a life on dialysis. Why won't you do this? And Coleman, in her early research, there was a woman who had BRCA gene in the Netherlands, and her mother had died of breast cancer. And as soon as she turned 18, she went to the physician and she asked for a full prophylactic mastectomy. And the doctor said, that's crazy, you're too young to throw away your whole life like this. So in the first case, it was a doctor saying, you're not pursuing enough medicine. And in the second case, it was too much medicine. And we thought, what would it look like to bring these two stories together? So we came up with what we call ethno fiction, which is a fictional story but based on ethnography, just like historical fiction is based on history. And each character represents a lot of our research. So the two stories are about Layla is the Egyptian girl who comes from a sort of lower socioeconomic circle, and her dad is the caretaker or the baweb of the apartment building. And in this apartment building lives this American expat family, and their daughter, Anna, is the same age as Layla. And so Anna and Layla grow up together, playing in the garden in Cairo. They play with lizards and cats, and we see them as they grow up. Eventually, Layla becomes a medical student in Cairo University Medical Center. And there, when she's working really hard, she discovers that her father has been suffering silently from kidney failure, and it's not really caught until it's full-on renal failure. And the family is going through this decision of what should he do now, and he's adamant that he doesn't want to take a kidney from his daughter or his son. And then meanwhile, Anna, who's Layla's best friend, when she was a child, she had to see her mother suffer from breast cancer. And Layla was kind of the strong support that she needed as her mother, thank you. Slowly succumbed to the disease. And after her mother died, Anna went to the United States for college, and it's there in a genetics class that she realizes that there's something called BRCA and that she might carry it, and she realizes she might have the fate of her mother. And so just as Anna's grappling with what do I do with this information, but she has a perfectly healthy body, Layla is saying, what can we do to save my father? And there's so much illness and just not enough resources to cover it all. And so neither character understands the other. That was the premise of a strong friendship between two women who are very close in many ways, but each is faced with a medical decision that the other just can't understand. And that puts their friendship to the test. And then the Egyptian Spring, the Arab Spring breaks out, and there's revolution in the streets, and they end up getting swept up with it. And in that process of seeing how people will always calculate risk and benefit differently, they come to understand one another. So part of how we did this in terms of getting the artists is we knew that was going to be a ton of work, and we had a short time frame, like less than 2 years, which is actually short, believe it or not, for academic book production. And so we thought to get two artists to make the artwork go easily, and each artist took on a character, just like Coleman and I had each taken on a character in developing them. And it worked for the story because the premise was that each one doesn't quite understand the other, so you see the Anna scenes in Anna's artistic style, in the artistic style of Sarula Bowell, the artist who did that one, and you see the Layla scenes in Caroline Brewer's artistic style, and then towards the end, the two styles merge. Okay, so that's kind of an introductory to the Lissa project.
And I'll add my endorsement. It's a really great book. I'm trying to incorporate it into my own teaching right now. So my project diverges quite a lot from the one you just heard about, but there's also a lot of overlap to discuss. So my book is called The Look of a Woman, Facial Feminization Surgery and the Aims of Trans Medicine. So I'm a medical anthropologist, which basically means that I take all of the observational and methodological tools of cultural anthropology and apply them to studying health, illness, wellness, how people think about their bodies and manage their bodies. And one of the core principles of anthropological research is you can't make claims about people unless you spend a lot of time with them. You have to hang around with people, not simply walk in, take a lay of the land, and then write a book and tell everybody what people are like. So my book is an ethnography, a product of having spent a year of time in surgical clinics and operating rooms of trans women. So these are people who, when they were little, everyone called them boys, and when they came to define themselves, called themselves women. So these women went to seek out medical intervention to change their bodies to make them more reflect the person that they know themselves to be. Transgender medicine is really interesting to study as an anthropologist for a lot of reasons, one of which is that it's always been controversial. We have never had a time when there's been such a thing as sex and gender altering medicine when we haven't also been fighting about it. And if you pick up any newspaper or magazine and read about trans medicine and you are foolish enough to look at the comments, you'll see that there are ongoing, really strong positions of people fighting about whether and how we can change our bodies, what it means to have an identity that's different somehow from what other people think that it is, and whether or not sex and gender altering medicine is ethical, should be legal, should be paid for by taxes, etc. So I'm interested in the politics and the practice of this form of medicine. So the politics, meaning who gets to do it, who decides, what resources are used to support these forms of intervention, and then also the practice. How does transgender medicine actually work? It turns out that we haven't spent a lot of time in clinics where trans medicine is being done, largely because it is such a controversial practice. And so as an anthropologist, I wanted to spend time there and understand what's going on in clinical spaces, what are patients asking for from doctors, what do doctors think they're doing, what does that interaction look like? So what I chose to study for this particular project of my larger research is facial feminization surgery. So I'm going to call that FFS. And facial feminization is a set of bone and soft tissue reconstructive surgical procedures that are intended to make trans women look more feminine. So the basic gist of it goes like this, that the patients would tell me time and time again. No one walks down the street looking in your pants before they decide whether they're going to call you a man or a woman. That's not actually how social sex and gender work. Social sex and gender work on what we see and perceive about each other. And for these trans women then, whether or not they ever had body-altering procedures to change anything else on their bodies, what brought them to the clinic was the absolute certainty that their masculine faces made them unrecognizable as the women they knew themselves to be. That no matter what they did in terms of changing their clothes or any other kinds of medical interventions they might do, if when walking down the street other people saw and perceived their masculine faces, they would say, that's a man in a dress. And they wouldn't allow, these onlookers wouldn't recognize these trans women as women. So as a result of that, they sought these facial structure altering procedures so that when other people saw them, they would say, that's a woman. Right? And according to these, the patients that I worked with and many other people outside the clinic, this kind of change was far more important and had a far greater impact on their everyday life than any other kind of intervention might. And this practice then pushes against this long-held understanding that we've had about what trans medicine is about as a genital-centric intervention. Right? When you hear people, when Caitlyn Jenner was all the talk in the news and everyone said, did she have the operation? We all knew what operation they were talking about, right? So this fascination or this long-held claim that what trans people need is a different set of genitals, that actually doesn't turn out to be the case when you hang out with a lot of people outside of clinics in general, but certainly the case for FFS patients who said, what I need to do is change what people see when they see me. It's about recognition, right? So as an anthropologist, this is an interesting practice, and it also is informed by decades of gender and sexual theory that are telling us that maybe sex and gender are not necessarily determined by your reproductive anatomy, but have something to do with how you exist in the world, how you see yourself and how other people see you. So the arguments that I make in the book is that as our ideas about what sex and gender are change, so do the kind of interventions that one might have to undergo to intervene in them. And so the book uses these facial surgeries as a way to both think about the politics and practice of trans medicine in real time and place, and also to speak back to these sort of theoretical framings about what sex and gender are. So what I did for my research was I hung out in clinics, surgical clinics, in operating rooms. I talked to patients, I went to conferences, I hung out with surgeons. Mostly I hung out with one particular surgeon who developed these procedures in the early 1980s. His name is Dr. Douglas Osterhout. That is his real name. He has asked me to use his real name in all of my work because he's very proud of the work that he's done. So I want to make sure that usually that would be a violation of my ethical principles to tell you who my people really are, but he really wants you to know who he is. So in the 80s, he developed these procedures by looking at archaeological records and how archaeologists use bones and assess things about ethnicity, about age, about race, and about sex based on bones. So he first asked, where do archaeologists see the difference between male and female faces? If this is my project, how can I see that and then change it? So he first looked at archaeological literature. Then he looked at some orthodontic studies that just happened to have really good measurements of faces, because there was this long-term project that they used to take an X-ray of kids' heads every year on their birthday from when they started first grade through senior year of high school. We don't X-ray kids' heads every year anymore. So we don't have really good updated information. So these little group of studies that were done in the mid-century US remain the benchmark for whether or not you get braces, for example. So it's a really interesting body of literature. So then he used these two metrics to say, well, this is what masculine looks like. This is what feminine looks like. How can I devise a set of procedures that take me from one to the other? So I spent time in his office, and I spent time with patients to ask what it is that people wanted from surgery, whether that surgery gave them what they wanted. How did it change their lives? Most people I met said, this is the most amazing and life-changing thing that's ever happened to me. Other people said, this doctor's terrible and everyone should avoid him. It's basically like everything that happens anytime you go to try to find a doctor, right? The people who say things are the people who love him or the people who hate him. But the mediumly satisfied people, they just don't bother going online, right? But the idea was that, in fact, what trans women wanted had nothing to do with this long sort of history that we used to call transsexual medicine, and instead was about listening to people to say what it is that they want. What is it that would change my life? Not what the diagnostic book says, but what will change my life, and allowing these trans women to tell their own story and seek out the interventions that they most wanted. So that is the project.
Thank you. And I will also endorse Eric's book. It's really great, and it's a beautiful blend of, this is a nice cover as well, and it's a really nice blend of theoretically sophisticated research, but really beautiful and accessible writing and storytelling, which is an incredibly difficult balance to strike. So there are so many overlaps and convergences between our projects, and so I'm just going to open up a few different connections, and then we're going to talk them through together before we open it up for questions. So, one of the, I think the most striking things is that across all of our projects, we see this really significant tension emerge between the promise of medicine and then also the pitfalls or the perils that come along with only turning to medical models as a solution for questions around embodiment, futurity, and a range of other questions that are deeply connected to the political environment, to the social environment, and a range of other things that medicine can't necessarily address. So if we look at the context of Lissa, one of the tensions that we draw from is, on the one hand, we have people saying, okay, in the Egyptian context, there are incredibly high rates of kidney disease and kidney failure, and the solution is, you get dialysis until you get a transplant, but if you don't get a transplant, that's it. And the reason why there are really high rates of kidney failure is because of environmental toxicity and a range of other issues. And so you get a kidney transplant, but that's not going to fix these larger things that continue to put you at risk. And you get an organ from a family member, now they only have one kidney, and now they're also at environmental risk. And then you look at the context of BRCA genetics, and people are very grateful to have access to this genetic knowledge about their elevated cancer risk. But the options available to you to manage your risk aren't great. You get preventive surgeries, and you get screening, and those are the options. There's not a cure. And the things that put you at greater risk are environmental exposures, a whole complex range of things. But nonetheless, medicine offers possibilities to manage this risk where the larger political and economic structures don't necessarily offer ways for us to control those types of risks to our health and our futurity. And then you think about the context of trans medicine and the ways in which, thinking about your social genitals and your face, and the tremendous violence that can fall upon someone when a gender binary, male-female, is the way in which our world is organized, you can't escape those types of gendering in your day-to-day life. And while it's really important for us to shift social and political norms, I think one of the things that you point to is, but in the meantime, how do you survive and how do you build a life for yourself? And ways that, that can help you live your gender and help you live. And those are really, and medicine offers those possibilities, but it also isn't a solution. And it certainly isn't the only solution. And so I think that's one of the tensions that we see across all of our projects. I think another one is time. You know, across each of our projects too, one of the things I think that's really powerful about your work is you say, well, yes, like we need political and social change. The gender norms that we have available to us are inadequate in many ways, and they don't allow for flourishing. But in the meantime, how do you craft a livable life in your gendered embodiment? And another question, you know, with the BRCA genes, like these are, people are intervening in futures, but they've also been, a lot of women with family cancer histories have watched tons of family members die of cancer. And so, you know, the comment streams for women who are getting preventive surgeries are equally appalling. And I've heard people refer to it as selfish, as mutilation, a range of other things. And the gender norms around that, of course, are striking. But trying to intervene in a future so that you can have that future, and not having the political tools. And I mean, this is one of the things that we chose to end our book with the Egyptian Revolution because that's a different version of futurity that says we're going to craft a future that we want to live in the present, that says there is a better and a better way of living. And medicine is always about politics. And politics is a health issue. And so thinking about the ways in which these timelines are imagining the future and the present, but also finding a way to craft a good enough present in the face of political and social inequalities. So those are a few themes that we could start to talk about, but and draw out, but I actually want to start with one question, which is, so our book's a graphic novel. It's all about visual narratives, and we tell these stories in comic form. And we thought that was a really powerful way to convey the complexities of our bodies' relationships to medical systems, political systems, global environments, and a range of other things. And so our whole book is crafted around visual storytelling. And Eric makes a choice in his book, which is not to show any visuals. And not to do any visual storytelling. And so I kind of wanted to open it up to you, Eric, to think about why did you make some of those choices, and maybe to talk through these tensions around visual frameworks and visual thinking.
When I first started work on this project and when I would present on it, I would show before and after photos. Before surgery, after surgery. There is perhaps no more pleasing genre of visualization than the before and after pair, right? My car before, it was waxed, my car afterwards. And we love this, right? And so especially when you're trying to make a claim that a surgical procedure, a reconstructive surgical procedure, can do something so powerful as alter someone's perception of your sex, just face alone, everyone wants to see that, right? And so I used to show those images when I would do these presentations, but I didn't really like what I got from responses, which a lot of it was this sort of like, I've already told you what I'm showing you, right? You already know what it is you're seeing. And so the audience started to play these sort of like, I can tell games, right? I can totally tell. Or, oh my God, I can't tell, right? And so it started to be way more about what the audience thought they could see. And it ended up and I didn't like that game, because part of the project of the book is to make the claims about what kind of faces are masculine and what kind are feminine a really difficult thing to define. I'm trying to make that hard. And so the act of then choosing exemplary photographs of masculinity and exemplary photographs of femininity undoes the whole project of the book. But people still oftentimes ask me, do you have any before and afters? And I say, I'm not going to show you that. Can you think about embodied masculinity and femininity without a picture to help you? What would that look like to you? The other part of the problem is that all the time when we see faces and what we think we're looking at is sex on a face, right, male or female, there's also all these other kinds of things that I'm showing you, including the race of the person, the age of the person, the health of the person, all these other things. But all of that stuff gets made invisible when I say this is a picture of maleness. Right? And it turns out that most of the visual renderings that show up in medical journals, for example, use white folks as the examples of maleness and femaleness. But they never say that they're white folks. They say this is a male and this is a female. And so we're meant to see or understand that whiteness as invisible, which is part of how whiteness functions, right? That we get to not pretend it's not there. Instead, this is just a male face and just a female face. And I don't want to participate in that. So the push was to make you analytically have to think about these categories without the visual aid already produced by me to do it.
Shireen, do you want to talk a little bit about what possibilities there are for disrupting that in comics?
I had said the short version of this, and then Shireen was like, but comics. And I'm like, I don't know about comics.
So Scott Mccloud, who's a great theorist of comics, one of the things that he writes about in his book, Making Comics, is that the reason why people relate so well to the comic, even more so than the photograph, is because of how little information it gives. And so you can project onto it the rest, and you can identify, you could, put in your head something that looks more like you or someone that you would empathize with. And so I think it's that minimal information of comics that is potentially so radical, and you can do a lot to disrupt. So I was just thinking for Eric's stuff, I was like, but that's the whole thing. Like, you could have had like an only partial face, right, rendered, and it's the job of the reader to complete that and to think, where does the jawline go to make this a masculine face or a feminine face? And so people talk a lot, people who love comics talk a lot about the gutters, which is the space in between the panel. And that's why if you read a comic, it's like more of a lean forward kind of activity than watching a TV show, which is more kind of lean back. It's a more active process because it's up to the reader to fill in the blank between the panel, right? What just happened before and what happened after. And things can happen in that gutter. So for example, the first panel can show a knife, and then the second panel can show the bloodied corpse on the floor with a stab. And the murder happened in the gutter, right? So gutters can be, where all kinds of things happen, but you don't necessarily see it. It's left for your imagination. So that's exactly the kind of stuff that we were looking for when we approached the medium of comics for our academic book. It wasn't, people have this idea that comics is like a dumbing down of it simplifies the information. And obviously some comics do that. But we were really inspired by the potential of comics to add complexity by giving less visual information, by making the reader make those links to the connections that we were trying to draw. And just to give another example of how we wanted to disrupt it, a lot of people who were critical of our project were like, well, how can you have depicted this in Egypt and you didn't even have Egyptian artists? And that's the whole point of anthropology, is the premise that you can go and learn about another culture and depict it, right? Otherwise, why bother? And we took our artists to Egypt. It was part of the field research. They learned kind of the conventions of Egyptian comics. But our outsider status was part of what enabled us to disrupt some of those logics. So in comics, there's very highly gendered, typical, often ways of depicting female bodies, for example, with like tiny waists and large breasts. And this is a story about Anna coming to think of her breasts as potential time bombs that can set off, that can pose risks to herself and to her death. And not only that, all of the assumptions that people had around her, like, what? How are you going to get married? You can't possibly be thinking about that. She wanted to say, I can have a full life. Why? Stop reducing me to my reproductive or sexual viability, right? And it was part of that challenge of what do we show and how do we disrupt these kind of gender typical. Both our artists identify as queer, and they were also really committed to kind of disrupting some of these gender stereotyped ideas of what bodies should look like. And so Anna and Layla, they don't fit the kind of stereotypical idea of what attractive women are supposed to be. They're like full characters, and you see them in all kinds of complexity. What was the other thing? And then finally, what I wanted to say was we were also disrupting the colorism that exists in a lot of Egyptian, Middle Eastern, Arab, global world, where you get the lighter skin and dark characters are seen as the villains, and we didn't want to do that. And Layla is a dark-skinned Egyptian, very proud and wonderful character. And so my point is that not going with a conventional, say, Egyptian artist was an opportunity for us to use comics to disrupt ideas of the body that we wanted to also do through the story.
There's another interesting tension that came up because in visual storytelling you have to make tons of decisions around how much to show, and there were certain moments where we had made a decision to tell, have a particularly violent moment in the context of the police violence against protesters in Egypt, for example. And Shireen and I had written it, and then the illustrators drew up a panel, and we all looked at it together. We're like, we can't. This is too difficult. This is too much.
We gasped. I'll just fill in. We had a scene where part of what we wanted to show was what Coleman was talking about earlier, that sometimes the promise of medicine gets a person not quite prepared for the reality of what the surgery is going to look like, the surgical complications that could arise. Sometimes we think about a medical intervention in terms of transaction, like I'm going to get this thing, I'm going to get a new kidney and I'll be better, but post-transplant life is really challenging and it requires all of this management and maintenance. And the same thing for this mastectomy. A woman's like, I just want to get rid of my breast so I don't have to worry about breast cancer, but there's surgical complications, there's risks. And so we knew that was the idea we wanted to convey, and we had Anna go to Egypt soon after her surgery. Do you want to fill in the rest of what it's?
This is a moment in which protests are really erupting across Cairo, and Layla, our doctor character, Anna's friend, has become one of Tyre's doctors. So she's on the ground tending to injured protesters who are being brutalized in a range of different ways. And she needs supplies. And so she calls Anna. Anna rushes supplies to her in the square. And on the way, she's intercepted by these basically like thugs. These men who've been paid to intercept protesters, which is a whole other layer of I won't get into. But and we initially had one of them. I guess it was like kick her. Yeah, we had kick her, and then it upsets her surgical scars, which are still quite fresh. And that moment, and then we have later in the day her kind of pulling up her shirt and wincing, and we see where her sutures have been kind of torn. And we're like, we can't have any of it. It was just too. It was all of it was just too much. And so thinking about that too, the ways in which, as much as like part of what's great about comics is it opens up the possibilities for you to help people access a story that might feel unfamiliar to them in a range of ways, or access characters that might feel unfamiliar to them because of the pared down representations. But there are other ways in which you still take a lot of risks with those visual stories. Maybe I'll just open up to you we have about 5 minutes left before questions, to talk maybe a little bit more about this tension between, or the temporality even of treatment, this idea that the treatment there is a solution, and how that fails to account for what post-surgical life can be.
For many of the people that I met who made it finally to the clinic, it was the culmination of years and years and decades of processes of self-discovery, to define themselves as a person who might want these procedures, to think that it can help them, and then to save the tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars that it takes to actually do that. So most folks were wealthy, and they were later in life, 40s and above usually, quite far above oftentimes, and they had resources to pay. But by the time that they had sort of defined that FFS was what they wanted and this was the life-changing thing, then as we all know who have to wait for something, it's impossible. Right? It's impossible to wait to get the thing that you say that you want. It's impossible when you say, I've got, $7,000 in my bank account and I need $65,000 to pay for this. And so there's a timeline of life temporality that's drawn out by a number of logistical concerns. But there is a sense, as you are both saying, about what medicine can do, right? This transactional sense, like, yes, I am going to get this, and I'm going to look amazing, and everything's going to be great, and the best pictures I've seen online, that's going to be me, and everything's going to be awesome. But surgery is hard. Reconstructive facial surgery is really intense. It's about, if you get everything done that they call FFS, you can be on the table for about 11 hours, and that is massive, right? And it takes a long time to heal. And it takes a long time, as the surgeons say, for the face to settle down. But at the other end of things, too, we all know that gender is not an accomplishment. You don't just become masculine one day and then you're just done the rest of your life, right? Femininity isn't an event. It's an ongoing set of practices that is constantly receding. And this is especially the case for femininity, which is always something that you have to be working toward but never quite arrive at, right? This is why the pharmacies are so full of weight loss plans and makeup and hair stuff and all these ways that you could be a better woman, right? So the event of the surgery, while it does kind of create this fulcrum point that is a major change and a significant one, it's not as though gender is done now. It's not as though one's womanness is now simply accomplished and completed. It is instead the introduction of a yet new set of issues, and it removes one set of concerns but does not alleviate the problem of gendering as a lifelong process. And so many people came back years later, right, to get their facelifts and to get their neck lifts and to get all these other things, right? All these other ways that especially feminine bodies fail at being feminine enough. And increasingly, surgery is seen as a solution for that, right? We were talking before about the sort of particularly uncanny look of people who have had a lot of facial plastic surgery, that you can see that there's something there, right? There's a particular kind of look there. The turn to the surgical as an event kind of solution to what is otherwise an unfolding in time of what gender is, especially in the body. Yeah.
So we're going to open it up to questions from you all now.
Was there one particular facial feature that was more came up more frequently as the first thing to be done in facial reconstruction?
Not particularly. It was up to patients, but the major intervention points are the points are forehead. The forehead can be set back. So if you think you have a strong forehead, that's just because there's a big space in between the part of your skull that holds your brain and the part of your skull that you can see. It's called a sinus. And you cut the front off and you put it back into the sinus. Change the nose, change the chin, change the squareness of the jaw, cheek implants potentially, raise the eyebrows, change the hairline, remove the Adam's apple. So all of those things. And it depends on the person, what they think is their problem area, and what they're most concerned about. But some people do all of it.
Who else? Put your hands up nice and high if you've got questions. Yeah.
I'm just interested in some comments about what insurance covers what and those kinds of struggles for both books, actually.
Oh, I could talk about Egypt. That's where we're talking. So there was universal health care under the socialist regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and then in the economic opening of Anwar Sadat in the 70s, you get the privatization of a lot of health care. So there was once this promise of universal health care for all citizens, and yet in the 70s, because of structural adjustment programs, you get a complete withdrawal of resources. So even though on the books Egyptians supposedly have universal access to healthcare, there's really very little resources put into public hospitals, and so people end up paying for most things out of pocket. If they go to the public hospitals, they're basically the teaching material for the medical students and the doctors, and sometimes those same medical doctors, because their salaries are so low because of the taking away of the state resources, they have private clinics in the evening, so they'll tell the patients, come in the evening and pay me, and then I'll actually do this properly. So it's a very sad situation. So like less than 3% of people who need new kidneys actually get them in Egypt, and a large proportion of those are pediatric, because families will, liquidate all their assets, sell their land, sell everything to be able to, risk the idea that this surgery might help their child.
Trans medicine in the United States, the insurance situation is changing rapidly as we sit. There was spotty insurance coverage depending on where you lived up until 1981 when Medicare explicitly said we no longer are covering what they called transsexual surgery. That ban, like most Medicare decisions, trickles down to the states and to private insurers. So that ban was in place from 1981 until 2014. In 2014, they overturned the ban, but they didn't replace it with a policy. So it just said, we're no longer not covering it, but it doesn't mean we are, which is, those of you who interchange with Medicare probably are familiar with that. So as a result of that change, then there are now 14 states and Washington, D.C. now cover trans-related care in their Medicaid programs, and half of all Fortune 500 companies provide transition-related medicine. Because transition is a really open term that can mean really different things to really different people, saying we provide transition-related benefits doesn't really tell you what they cover. And so it's very hit or miss. People move and change jobs in order to get access to care. Here in the state of Arizona, for example, our Medicaid provides some services, but they deny them like as a sport. And we here at the University of Arizona, our students have trans medicine-related benefits, but the faculty do not. So because we're state employees. So it's really, really spotty, and it's changing really rapidly what anything actually covers.
So a lot's changed with BRCA testing and surgeries in the U.S. as well, actually with the Affordable Care Act. So before the Affordable Care Act, for example, you couldn't, it wasn't guaranteed that you could get reconstruction. That wasn't necessarily covered. But now, if your insurance company will cover mastectomy, then they have to cover reconstruction. If they don't cover mastectomy, though, a simple mastectomy without reconstruction is $8,000 to $10,000. Accessing genetic testing has also been a really difficult thing in the landscape of the U.S. because of gene patenting protocols. And so Myriad Genetics, until 2013, had an exclusive patent on the BRCA genes, and they enforced it aggressively. But because, and this is like a cool thing, right? It's like you see patients transforming medicine, and researchers who are really engaged with patients and are engaged in this form of active listening have been changing the landscape too. So the ACLU and a number of researchers and patient organizations sued Myriad Genetics. And the Supreme Court decided that you can't patent unmodified human genes in 2013. And since then, the test went from being $3,000 only offered by Myriad Genetics with all sorts of these like weird, so another thing about Myriad was there was no incentive for them to do a lot of other research. So they would beyond the tests that they had available. So people would sometimes get their test results back from Myriad and be like, well, so that you do have a BRCA mutation, but we haven't researched this specific deletion, for example, to know whether or not it's actually connected to cancer. So for those populations, they're told they're at risk of being at risk until we've done more research. But since 2013, the landscape has changed. And you can now get BRCA testing in the US from other organizations for like as little as $300. And the populations that are being tested have expanded significantly. So more people are getting information about their particular variants than they were before. But there are gender norms that even get embedded within, for example, policies around what types of procedures insurance will cover. So there's not a lot of insurance company coverage for men getting BRCA testing, even though 50% of people who carry BRCA mutations are men. If you have certain forms of family history, then it might be covered, but if you don't, then it won't be covered. And then, if you don't have a BRCA mutation, and or if you have a certain variant of the BRCA mutation, then it means your surgeries might not be covered. And so it's a really complicated set of problems that emerge out of a very patchy insurance landscape that's constantly changing.
I wanted to ask you about some of the ethical dilemmas that patients face when they undergo kidney transplantation or FFS operations.
Yeah, thanks. So in the Egyptian context, so my first book before we turned this into a graphic novel is called Our Bodies Belong to God, because a lot of times in Egypt you would ask people, why don't you like the idea of organ transplantation? They'd say, because our bodies belong to God. It's not for us to give or transplant or move around. But that seems like a very totalizing, absolutist statement. Our bodies belong to God. It sounds like that's it forever, like they don't want medicine. But it turns out that, these are the same patients who would not hesitate to give a kidney if it was their child. Or these are the same patients who say, every day I'm praying that they'll become stem cell opportunity for transplant so I don't have to rely on someone else. And so you dig a little deeper beyond that body belongs to God statement. What are they really saying? And it turns out that there's a whole range of reasons why people don't like organ transplantation in Egypt. So the risks are very high and they don't have as great outcomes as here. And because there's a vibrant black market in organs that has exploited poor and sometimes undocumented migrants for whom Cairo is like a way station before they try to migrate upward to Europe. And so because of those very negative connotations, our body belongs to God could mean so many things. Sometimes, a mother would say, my body, thank God, God made me have 2 kidneys so that I could give one to my son and save my son. And sometimes it was people saying, no way will I let my wife do this because I'm going to die anyway, and I don't want to leave her weaker to look after our children. And so the book was kind of digging deeper into those ethical decisions beyond that title, because I remember reading this one of these, American journalists, or actually he was British, but, who traveled to Middle East for like a week and come up with these ridiculous, preposterous things. And so one of the things he was saying was, of course, the Middle East isn't on a path to democracy. This is like really stereotypical stuff because of this, religious ideas, and some of these people even are against organ transplant because the body belongs to God, but once they get over that, then they can be open to democracy. And it's like, no, there's a corrupt regime. It has a lot to do with our own foreign policy, unfortunately, and it's created this really unregulated medical and environmental situation in which people are highly disposed to organ failure. And even those people who are donating organs in Egypt and who are advocating for the practice are also saying the body belongs to God. I mean, that doesn't in and of itself stop you from a belief of God or God's ownership of the body.
One of the ethical dilemmas that I talk about comes from the cost of these procedures. They're very, very expensive and not covered by insurance, so you have to have a lot of money to get them. And one of the critiques from within the trans community is basically says, terrific. Now you have this group of people who is already resourced And what they're doing is paying to get themselves out of social exclusion and violence that is now more directed toward the gender non-conforming trans folks, right? So we can say, for example, well, there's this surgery. You know you could look like this person. You know you could get rid of that big wide jaw. You know you could do that. Well, not everybody could do that. Right? And so the fact that there is this very resourced small group of folks who can afford to do that, these critics argue, just make the other gender nonconforming folks even more suspicious and even more conspicuous because they also don't have the money or resources to make themselves palatable to folks who would like to see a very particular version of what masculinity and femininity look like. So people were challenged by that, and some folks said, okay, well, I get that that's a problem. Not everyone can pay for everything. That's really sad, except for I deserve to be happy, don't I? Right? And this is we have an American obsession with authenticity, right? And personal happiness. And so these critics would respond by saying, individualizing these choices is precisely what makes what sets out the violence against trans folks as not being a set of individual choices, but about being systemic. And to individualize your choice ignores the systematicity of those kinds of things. So that was one of the things that I looked at. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question about the BRCA gene. Do you think that there is more acceptance for preventative mastectomies with individuals who are test positive for the BRCA gene in the medical community or in the insurance community? Do insurance even cover preventative mastectomies?
Yeah. So this is again, an Affordable Care Act thing, actually, where it was a lot of policies have been put in place around if you have a family history, then your insurance should cover it if you have insurance. But yeah, I mean, strangely, okay, well, there are two things. One is that within the medical community, since BRCA testing became available in the 1990s, preventive surgeries have been encouraged, particularly in the context of the U.S., as this is the gold standard. This is the most effective way to reduce your risk. It's looked different. So I did some research in France where it was frowned upon. Whereas this is an extreme measure. No, we're not going to encourage this. But you also have the U.S. is a consumer-based model, whereas France there's doctors are gatekeepers. So it's a little different. But actually, in terms of public perception, Angelina Jolie has quite significantly changed the tide around acceptance for preventive surgeries in terms of social acceptability, at least. So and actually after that, there was this wave of medical panic where doctors were like, now everybody's going to want a mastectomy, which was they call it the Angelina effect. But there are a lot of misperceptions that also came out of the Angelina surgery, which is the kind of reconstruction that she accessed was incredibly expensive, and a lot of the ways in which they even talked about the possibilities for reconstruction and the risks that come along with there are multiple elective surgeries that come along with reconstruction, and it's not another thing that's it was like getting implants. It's not like getting implants at all, and you can no longer feel those tissues. But anyway, so there are a lot of complexities around that. But yeah, I think Angelina Jolie, interestingly, has really changed public perception. And BRCA testing is incentivized for insurance companies because it's a lifelong reduction in possible costs for people who are elevated risk of cancer. So from an economic calculus, they're on board.
I have a friend who had a double mastectomy, and she was talking about when she was going through this, there was a lot of pressure from her doctors to have reconstructive surgery, and she really had to fight to not have it. And so I don't know if any of that is reflected in what your research or in the book or not.
So we actually made a decision in the book for our character not to get reconstruction. And it's much less common in previvors, so people who are surviving their risk for cancer but don't have cancer, especially for young women like Anna. And we actually made a choice to not have her pursue reconstruction and I had to have her navigate these different, I mean, and part of it, yeah, there is, so definitely, the history of breast cancer treatment, Audre Lorde in the 1970s has this kind of amazing moment where she's like so mad that she has one breast and they keep making her wear a prosthetic. And she's like, this thing isn't for me. Like, it's itchy, it's uncomfortable. Like, it doesn't look or feel anything like my remaining breasts. And I don't want to wear it. But doctors are pressuring me to wear it. Like, everywhere I go, there's this pressure to hide the fact that I survived cancer. And to make my body better align with gender norms around what my body should look like. And it's about making other people comfortable, not making me comfortable. And it's absolutely difficult for you to pursue a preventive mastectomy in particular without getting reconstruction. And there are extra steps that you have to take to prove that this is not something that you want. Absolutely, yeah, and this has to do with gender norms and expectations around, and I mean, and it's difficult too for people who are gender non-conforming, and trans men because of the ways in which norms around femininity and breasts keep getting embedded within these surgical models.
Well, I just had a question about whether, as anthropologists, that you might see any time or progress toward people being able to be accepted more as non-binary identification. I know in Oregon you now have a non-binary driver's license that's available, and I'm just wondering if our external phenotype acceptance might be accepted differently.
Yeah.
So personally, I think that we're getting better towards more acceptance, but there's a cost to that. So when there's more acceptance, you also get a very ugly backlash coexisting. So I think we might see both at the same time. But Eric would know way more.
Well, I mean, just the fact that we now have language to talk about these identities and people can occupy that as an identity is a big thing, right? That's a change. But I mean, as anthropologists, we know that cultures are constantly changing, and things like the law are both reflect changes and constrain them. They enable things and they stop things. We know that around the world, people do gender very differently than we do. So there's no reason to say that our culture can't change more toward that direction, but I agree. There's, it's interesting, the last 2 days I've done 2 different interviews with people saying, what's the deal with the kids and the non-binary, right? And everyone, why are the kids doing this? Tell us about the kids, what is happening with the kids? So there are changes, there are new pushes, right? We were just talking about this from our students are demanding new things from us all the time. But there, as much as we focus our media attention on the kids and the non-binary, right? There's still way more kids that suffer violence and exclusion and murder and homelessness and suicide and unemployment as a result of being gender nonconforming than there are these amazing kids that are changing the wide world, right? It's that sort of like very particular focus that we seem to have on the fascination of the existence of trans folks who've been around for all the time. We're just all of a sudden going, hey, did you guys know that there are these people, right? And everybody in the community goes, yeah, we did, and so it's always changing. The question is in what ways, right? But sure.
It's just a quick thing. I live in Canada now, and the Canadian government is actually now on passports. There is an option for neither male nor female on the passport. But again, yeah, there are still all these different procedures and filling out the boxes, but you can see a small political change there. But
I just want to add one thing, which is just from the non-Western perspective. So a lot of times, unfortunately, in countries that were colonized, like the Arab world, Latin America, Indonesia, you can think of a lot of examples, the homophobic rhetoric is, this is Western import, just like the other colonial bad stuff that they did, and it's not authentic to Indonesia or the Arab world or whatever. And, anthropologically, we find that, in fact, pre-colonial, there was a wide range of gender performances and behaviors that were, in fact, accepted. And it was part of the process of colonialism that reified male-female roles through industrialization and the nuclearization of the family. And now that's reified as if that's the authentic. And the point isn't to say what's authentic, what isn't authentic, but just to recognize that this kind of homophobic discourse, like we see a lot in, say, Uganda or other parts of Africa, is really tied to the post-colonial condition.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for
being
listening.
here.
Good
Thank
questions.
you.
Yeah.